Now, this was another panel that I was really looking forward to because I've grown to really like this particular show. That said show being the History Channel's Vikings. It's created by Michael Hurst, who also brought us The Tudors, which I still haven't seen. Considering how much I like Vikings, I really should get on that. But Vikings has at this point gone through two seasons, and the main attraction at Comic Con was season three, which they are in the middle of shooting. It's set to premiere sometime in 2015, probably end of March, early April, maybe. Um, and the main premise of season three is basically Michael Hurst said this back when season two was airing, or at least about to air. He said, the scope is going to be bigger. We're going to have Ragnar and his group of and his army. It's not a group anymore; it's an army. They're really pushing the scope. We're going to have Ragnar and his guys attack Paris. I mean, he laid siege to Paris with tons of ships. I mean, really, in season one, they've kind of worked up to this. In season one, they had maybe one or two ships with 30 guys conducting raids on villages and farms. Now they've gotten to the point where they can they can portray these huge battles. Hopefully the battles will stay within the History Channel's budget, or at least creativity should never really be limited by the budget, at least not in a perfect world. So hopefully the History Channel is actually giving them the necessary funding to portray these big battles truthfully. Because usually when you try to do a big battle like this on TV, even in the good ones, even in the good pieces of entertainment, it does feel kind of limited by its format, by its television format. I mean, even in Game of Thrones, the Battle of Blackwater, I don't really think was as grand as it would have been had it been a big budget blockbuster movie. However, again, I completely trust Michael Hurst to give us what we have come to expect from Vikings at this point. I mean, I can't really sense any hint of computer generated armies in this show up to this point. I mean, that's one of the things I really love about this show is that the effects, almost everything in the show looks completely legit. I mean, from the numerous extras in Viking garb, to the locations, to the set design. I mean, everything just looks so authentic. I mean, yeah, you could argue certain formations are historically inaccurate, or maybe a piece of clothing doesn't really have the right material, or said material wouldn't be available in that region, or the Vikings would not have utilized this piece of clothing. You could argue that, but for the most part, I don't really think you're going to find a more accurate representation overall of the Viking culture, and that's actually one of the things I actually have to give Michael Hurst some props on. Michael Hurst has always struck me as a guy. I don't really know how true this is, but he's always struck me as a guy who actually has a definitive plan, and who actually has a definite attention to detail. I mean, he really seems like he always knows what he is doing. Um, I mean, occasionally you get writers who have written themselves into a corner, and their stories might suffer for it. Michael Hurst seems to always have a very solid, concrete idea of where he is going to go. And I think that has something to do with the fact that they're not trying to drag these seasons out for the standard 20 or 22 episodes. They're keeping it at a modest 10 episodes, so there's not really any kind of filler. But really, the trailer itself actually showcased a brighter color palette than the previous seasons, or at least that's what it looked like. I mean, the previous seasons, a lot of the color was very grayed out. A lot of the locations looked very bleak. They were still beautiful and really pleasing to the eye, but the color palette here just looks more vibrant. I don't really know if that's to signify a drastic change in location. Maybe if they're going for a brighter color palette when they actually invade Paris, and maybe go back to the more grayish, darker color palette when they go back to the Viking villages. I don't really know what they're going to do with that, but yeah, season 3. Of course I'm excited because again I really like these characters. I really like the historical authenticity. I really like the very. I like how believable a lot of the action scenes are. I've heard this show compared to Game of Thrones and how it might one day reach the popularity of Game of Thrones. I do think it's getting more popular as it's going along. I do think it's definitely building an audience, as it were. Although I don't really agree with comparing it to Game of Thrones, because the content on here is not nearly as risque as it is on something like Game of Thrones. And I think some people might actually look at that as a bit of a disadvantage. I don't look at it as a disadvantage because again these characters are deep enough and through clever tricks with the camera and with lighting, they can get away with with not explicitly showing a lot of these, nude scenes or the excessively gory scenes. I mean, it's just enough to where you can tell that it's not censored. I mean, to where you don't feel cheated by censorship, but at the same time, it's just they leave just enough of it to the imagination to where the History Channel is not going to get complaints or mistaken for HBO, as it were. So another reason I'm very excited for season 3 is again the increase in scope, because a lot of the skirmishes, even the bigger skirmishes in this show, have been fairly small scale in comparison to other things like, I keep coming back to this, the Lord of the Rings. I mean, at most, I think we've had maybe 50 guys versus 50 guys. A lot of it has been they have been small skirmishes. I mean, having this show tackle a huge battle, this essentially an invasion of this city, is something that we haven't really seen before. We haven't really seen Ragnar and his guys attack a city before. We haven't really seen the golden age of Vikings yet. We've kind of been building up to that. I mean, the first 2 seasons have essentially been Ragnar rising up and becoming poised to be the legendary figure that he is known to be. And I think the fact that they went with Ragnar Lothbrok or Ragnar Lodbrok as the protagonist here, I actually think gives them a lot of wriggle room in terms of storytelling, because there have actually been debates over whether or not Ragnar was even a real person. I mean, and how maybe the legendary figure of Ragnar Lodbrok might have some historical basis in a lot of these other real historical figures. So having this very legendary figure as your protagonist in this very historically authentic show, you don't really have to adhere to a lot of historical events. I mean, with something like Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, there are many different events and many different happenings and goings on in Abraham Lincoln's time in trying to get the amendment passed that you actually have to adhere to. With Ragnar Lothbrok, there really is not that much in the way of limitations as to where you can take the character. I mean, we know he's going to become this legendary hero, but how you get there is really where a lot of the freedom comes in. And up to this point, I've become very invested in the character of Ragnar Lothbrok. Really, what really disappoints me is the fact that, according to legend, he is eventually going to be executed by King Isla, the Ivan K character, the really pudgy king who teams up with King Egbert in the 2nd season. Not looking forward to that, considering how much I've grown to like Ragnar and his group of allies. However, that actually does present an interesting question, not really in relation to the upcoming season 3, but maybe in future seasons. And that question is, can this show survive without the original principal cast? I mean, can you potentially pass on the mantle of the protagonist to other Vikings who became just as famous, if not more famous, than Ragnar? I mean, can you eventually hand the show over to Bjorn Ironside or Ivar the Boneless, both of which have been incorporated into the show at this point? So that's an interesting issue that they might have to deal with a little bit down the line, assuming they even do another time skip. So yeah, Vikings season 3. I'm very excited about it. The trailer really set the tone nicely. It really set the general premise of season 3 up nicely without necessarily giving too much away. A lot of the trailer was just the seer, the oracle guy, narrating over numerous images of characters preparing for battle. So yeah, it was a good trailer, and hopefully it'll pave the way for a very good and exciting season that really pushes the show to new boundaries in terms of how epic it can be.